The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Belmont's, casting a warm glow across the elegant dining room. Sophie wiped down table 7 for the third time, her hands trembling slightly as she noticed the well-dressed couple being seated in her section. She had been working at this upscale restaurant for only 2 months, still finding her footing in a world that felt far removed from her quiet life. At 28, Sophie had always been the shy one, the girl who preferred listening to speaking, observing rather than being noticed. The gentleman, probably in his early 40s, wore a sharp navy suit that spoke of success and confidence. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled. Even from across the room, Sophie could sense the air of importance that surrounded him. Beside him sat an elegant woman in her late 60s, her silver hair swept into a graceful bun. Wearing a cream-colored blouse and pearl necklace that caught the light, Sophie took a deep breath and approached their table. Her notepad clutched perhaps a bit too tightly. "Good afternoon," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Welcome to Belmont's. My name is Sophie, and I'll be taking care of you today." The man, who introduced himself as Daniel Morrison, gave her a polite nod. But it was his mother, Margaret, who caught Sophie's attention. The older woman's eyes were kind, but Sophie noticed something different in the way she watched people's lips as they spoke, the way her gaze focused so intently on faces rather than wandering around the room as Daniel began ordering. Sophie observed Margaret carefully. The realization dawned on her slowly but surely. Margaret was deaf. Sophie's heart raced. Years ago, her younger brother had been born with severe hearing loss. She had learned sign language to communicate with him, spending countless evenings practicing until her hands could speak as fluently as her voice. Though her brother had later received cochlear implants, those signing skills had remained with her, tucked away in her memory like a precious gift waiting to be used again. When Daniel finished ordering for both of them, Sophie did something that surprised even herself. She turned to Margaret, made sure she had her attention, and began to sign. "Is there anything special you would like today? Any preferences or dietary needs?" Margaret's face transformed. The polite smile she had been wearing melted into something genuine, something that lit up her entire expression. Her hands moved quickly, enthusiastically, as she signed back. "You know sign language? Oh, my dear, what a wonderful surprise. I would love the salmon if it's fresh, and perhaps a side salad with the dressing separate, if that's not too much trouble." Sophie signed back with a warm smile. "Of course, it's no trouble at all. I'll make sure everything is perfect for you." Daniel had been looking at his phone, handling what seemed like an important email. When he glanced up and saw his mother's face, he froze. The joy radiating from Margaret was something he hadn't seen in a very long time, certainly not at a restaurant where she usually sat quietly, nodding along, disconnected from the full experience. "Mother?" he asked, concern and curiosity mixing in his voice. "Is everything all right?" Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. She pointed to Sophie and signed something to her son. Daniel's brow furrowed. He had never learned to sign, something he suddenly felt acutely ashamed about. Sophie, seeing his confusion, spoke gently. "Your mother is just letting me know what she'd like to order. I wanted to make sure she felt comfortable communicating directly." Daniel's expression shifted. He watched as Sophie and his mother continued a brief exchange in sign language, his mother's hands moving with animation, Sophie's responding with patient grace. For the first time in perhaps years at a public dining establishment, his mother wasn't relying on him to be her voice. She was having her own conversation. Throughout the meal, Sophie checked on their table regularly. Each time, she would speak to Daniel, but then turn to Margaret, signing to ask if everything was to her liking, if she needed anything else, if she was enjoying the food. Margaret would respond with increasing warmth, and each time, Daniel noticed his mother's posture becoming more relaxed, more present. When dessert came, Margaret signed something longer to Sophie, who nodded and signed back. After Sophie left the table, Daniel finally asked, "Mother, what are you two talking about?" Margaret pulled out a small notepad she always carried and wrote, "She asked about my life. She wanted to know if I've always been deaf. I told her since I was 40. She shared that her brother is hard of hearing. She understands, Daniel. Someone finally understands without me having to explain. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. His mother, this woman who had raised him with such strength and grace after his father passed, who had never complained about her hearing loss, who always assured him she was fine, had been lonelier than he realized. When Sophie brought the check, Daniel asked her to wait a moment. He looked at his mother, then back at Sophie, and to everyone's surprise, including his own, his eyes filled with tears. "I need to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have taken my mother to countless restaurants, hundreds of business dinners, family gatherings, celebrations, and never, not once, has anyone made the effort to communicate with her directly. She always has to go through me or write notes, or simply smile and nod while feeling completely left out." Sophie felt her own eyes welling up as she listened. Daniel continued, "You gave her something today that I've failed to give her for years. You gave her dignity. You gave her independence. You made her feel seen." His voice cracked. "I should have learned to sign. I should have done this for her myself." Margaret reached over and put her hand on her son's arm, shaking her head. She signed to Sophie, who translated softly. "She says you've been a wonderful son. She says love shows itself in many ways, and you've shown it every day of your life." Several other diners had noticed the emotional scene. The restaurant had grown quieter, people sensing something profound was happening at table 7. Daniel wiped his eyes and pulled out his wallet. But instead of just leaving payment, he included a tip that was 3 times the bill. But more than that, he pulled out his business card and wrote something on the back.
Sophie?
"I don't know what your dreams are, or what you want from life, but I run a foundation that works with accessibility and inclusion programs. If you're ever interested in doing more than waiting tables, though you do that beautifully, I would be honored to help you find a place where your gifts could reach more people." Sophie took the card with shaking hands. Overwhelmed, as they prepared to leave, Margaret stood and did something unexpected. She pulled Sophie into a gentle embrace, the kind of hug that grandmothers give, full of warmth and gratitude. Then she signed one more thing. "You reminded me today that I'm not invisible." "Thank you for seeing me," Sophie signed back, tears now flowing freely. "You could never be invisible. You're radiant." As Daniel and Margaret left the restaurant, he held his mother's arm. But there was something different in the way they moved together. He leaned down and said something to her, and though Sophie couldn't hear it, she saw Margaret nod and smile. The other diners who had witnessed the exchange began to clap softly, a gentle acknowledgement of the beauty they had just seen. Sophie returned to the back, where her manager found her crying in the hallway. "What happened out there?" he asked with concern. "I just remembered why kindness matters," Sophie said. "I almost didn't approach that table. I almost let my shyness win, but I'm so glad I didn't." 3 months later, Sophie started working with Daniel's foundation, developing training programs to teach service industry workers basic sign language. Margaret became a friend, often joining Sophie for tea and conversation, their hands dancing through stories and laughter, and Daniel finally enrolled in sign language classes. It was his mother's 72nd birthday gift, though they both knew he was really giving it to himself, making up for lost time. Learning to speak the language of love that had always been there, waiting for him to embrace it. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. A moment of recognition, a choice to see someone fully, to step outside our comfort zone and meet another person where they are. These simple acts can change everything in a world that often moves too fast, that overlooks the quiet ones, the different ones, the ones who communicate in ways we haven't learned. There's profound power in simply paying attention, in choosing connection over convenience, in remembering that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, carrying a loneliness we cannot see, unless we take the time to truly look. Sophie learned that day that her shyness wasn't a weakness. It was what made her observant. It was what helped her notice what others missed. And in noticing and acting on that observation with simple human kindness, she didn't just change a meal. She changed lives. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the goodness in everyday moments. Leave a comment below about a time when a small act of kindness made a big difference in your life. Your story might inspire someone else to reach out, to notice, to care.